Hi again then guys, and welcome to yet another look back into the Test Drive Unlimited franchise, once again to the second game in particular. And this vehicle, the Aston Martin DBS, apart from just being a really good looking car, arguably one of the best looking Astons ever made, you could quite justifiably argue, it's one of those cars which I occasionally reference on the channel, not this one specifically necessarily, but more this kind of car where you cannot fully appreciate what makes a car like this so desirable just from a game. And of course you could say that really about any car, but with certain cars it really is apparent when you think about it that this is the kind of car that needs to be experienced in the real world in all of its facets. Not just how fast it may be or how much power it has, but it's more than that. It's the attention to detail, it's the interior, in some cases it's the practicality, the usability. In the case of, for instance, something like a Nissan R35 or a Tesla or a Ferrari FF or an Aston Martin Rapide even, the fact that you can use that performance every day is just something that you simply can't use. In a game you don't need practicality. At least in most driving games. Now in the case of the DBS, I would actually put it in a similar category, because on paper it's not the strongest thing around. Even in the A3 category, which this one is, it is better than some of the other cars in some ways. In fact, it's a lot better than some. If you compare it to the Spiker Aileron, which is also in the A3 category, this has got 110 horsepower more than that car. But at the same time it weighs almost 300 kilos more, so you can kind of understand why it's still in that same category. Now the DBS is basically a fancier version of the DB9 in essence. Of course debuted, I think it was in Bond, if I recall correctly, the Daniel Craig era of Bond, specifically in Casino Royale. I don't think it was available as a production car before that, if I recall correctly, but I may be wrong. And it's the kind of car that just, it dominates the scene. Wherever it is, it's got a ton of presence, it's a gorgeous looking machine, and it's one of the relatively few cars that I would put in the same category as something like a Koenigsegg, where they look good in pretty much any colour. And if you think about it, there actually aren't that many cars that are like that. There are some cars that look downright hideous in certain colours, but there are some which can pull off any colour. And I would say that the DBS is actually one of those. Now in terms of what you get, the DBS kind of comes from that later 2000s period in Aston Martin and early 2010s where they were really favouring these 5.9 litre V12 layouts, and this car has one of those, just under 6 litres, puts out 510 horsepower and 420 pound-feet of torque. It's naturally aspirated, as the vast majority of Aston Martins are. Of course that's changing nowadays, but at this point they were still pure in that regard. Those big 12-cylinder, kind of old school approaches, Italian even in some ways. The car itself is pretty heavy. As I alluded to earlier on, it's a lot heavier, for instance, than the Spiker. As an example, it weighs just under 1,700 kilos, 1,695 to be exact. And of course, again, that's one of the issues with the car, because in the real world, who really cares how heavy it is? You can't feel that most of the time when you're driving it. You only feel it if you're trying to push the car hard, for instance, for a lap time. And the vast majority of owners don't really care about that. They're just enjoying the car on the road. In a game, on the other hand, you notice stuff like that very quickly. It's a heavy car. If it feels like a heavy car, that can accentuate the problem. And the fact that it is so heavy means that even with 510 horsepower, you're still only looking at the kind of horsepower per tonne that some much smaller, less powerful sports cars can have, due to their weight advantage. Just over 300 horsepower per tonne doesn't sound as impressive as you'd probably hope it would be on something like this, especially given the pretty hefty 238,000 credit price. Now as far as whether or not you should buy one of these, I think it really is a case, funnily enough, in the category that would usually apply to Spiker, of being the kind of car that you should buy if you specifically want to represent your love for that car and for that brand. If you are an Aston Martin fan, if you like the DBS anyway, then yes, you can definitely use this one to win races in the A3 category. And if I remember correctly, I think I might have actually used this one quite a bit myself. Is it the best in category? No, not necessarily. There are cheaper ones, there are lighter ones, but it is it has to be said, a very good all-rounder. The top speed is pretty good, around 190, the 0 to 60 is around 4 seconds, so it's certainly not bad by any means. And the handling is definitely heavier. You can feel the weight, as I mentioned earlier, but it's smooth, it's pretty controlled, you can drift it if you want to, and it is a very pleasurable experience to drive a car like this. Aston Martins are kind of well respected when it comes to how good they are to drive. And for good reason. The DBS feels great. The DB9 was already a very widely loved car, so basically making this hardcore version of it, it's not too surprising that it's a great car. Now something like, for instance, a V12 Vantage, which is essentially the smaller sibling to this car, yeah, it's technically a better performance machine, you could say, because it has all of the same kind of advantages, including a similar amount of power, but in a more compact layout, and it makes it more manoeuvrable. The DBS, on the other hand, is essentially more of this elegant, long-distance Grand Tourer, but with a definite hardcore slant on it. So, in a similar way to something like a Vanquish, or an SLR McLaren, or some others like that, it's got the long-distance ability, and the comfort, and the luxury, and the style, and the class, but when it needs to, it can put down a good lap time, it can drive quickly, it can certainly beat certain opponents. So overall, it's the kind of car that won't necessarily blow your mind in the world of Test Drive Unlimited, and again, that's why I say that it's a car that you really need to appreciate in all of its brilliance rather than just in a game. And of course that's not really an option without something like VR and much better graphics, but it's everything about an Aston Martin. That's what makes them so good. It's not just the looks and the sound and the speed, it's the interior, it's the attention to detail. All of these smaller things that don't apply in a game are what make them such desirable cars, and for me, it's what actually made me like Aston Martin and appreciate them more and more over the years, to the point where I like them to a similar degree as companies that I've always loved, like Pagani, Spiker, various others like that as well, who have this incredible attention to detail. So overall, certainly worth a look in the A3 category. It's not one of the more affordable cars there, but it will serve you well. And that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.